Out of school, he developed into a quite attractive-looking youth, with a chin that wouldn't suffer from the use of a razor. Around that time, his father died. All he left his son were 4 completely worn-out vests, 2 old lamb's wool-lined coats, and a small sum of money. Apparently, the father had only been good at giving advice on saving money, and not so good at doing so himself. Chichikov immediately got rid of the decrepit family house and the little lot that went with it for 1,000 rubles. The family of serfs was moved to town to join him, as he had decided to enter government service. At that time, the teacher who loved silence and exemplary behavior was kicked out of the school for stupidity or some such reason. Out of disappointment, the former teacher took to the bottle. Soon, however, he was no longer able to pursue even that course, as he had run out of funds altogether. Sick, breadless, and abandoned, he was perishing in some unheated garret. His former pupils, the caustic wits and smart Alecs whom he'd always suspected of lack of discipline and aggressiveness, now, on discovering his miserable plight, immediately took up a collection for him, many of them even selling things they needed for their contribution. Only young Chichikov declared that he was going through a very difficult stretch and tried to get away with a 5-kopeck donation, which his former classmates threw in his face, calling him a stingy lout. The poor former teacher hid his face in his hands when he heard that his former pupils had done for him, and the tears gushed from his dimming eyes. "God has made me weep on the brink of the grave," he said in a weak voice. Then when he heard of Chichikov's behavior, he added, Pavel Chichikov, who would have thought that a human being could change so much? He used to be such a well-behaved boy. There was nothing wicked about him, nothing violent. Why, he was as smooth and soft as silk. I was mistaken, badly mistaken about him. It is not true, however, that by nature our hero was completely hard and callous, incapable of pity or compassion. He had feelings and would even have liked to help, although he didn't want to contribute a substantial sum, which would have involved dipping into his savings. He seemed to have profited from his father's advice about hanging on to pennies, but he didn't love money for its own sake. He was no miser. What he fancied for his future was a life of full contentment, a nice house, horses, great dinners, and all that. It was in order to obtain all this eventually that he grudged pennies to others as well as to himself. Catching sight of a wealthy man driving past in a rich carriage drawn by beautiful horses, he stood as if rooted to the ground, and then, as if coming out of a deep trance, he would sometimes comment, "Why, he used to be a simple office clerk." And everything that suggested opulence and gracious living had an effect on him that he himself was unable to understand. When he completed his school course, he didn't even want to take a short vacation. He was in such a hurry to get down to business and enter government service. But then, despite his excellent graduation certificate, he found it rather difficult to get a job in a government department. Protection is needed for even such lowly niches. The post he did get was insignificant, only bringing him between 30 and 40 rubles a year, but he decided to show keenness and to overcome all obstacles. And indeed, his austerity, his patience, and the modesty of his demands were unparalleled. From early in the morning to late at night, he scribbled on, sparing neither body nor soul, completely immersed in official documents. He wouldn't go home and spent nights in the office, sleeping on a desk. Sometimes he took his meals in the company of the hall porters and doormen, but managed, nevertheless, to be always neat, to be decently dressed, to communicate a pleasant expression to his face, and even to move with a certain distinction. It must be said that the civil service clerks around him were rather a shabby-looking lot. Some of them had faces that made one think of a badly baked loaf of bread, a bulging cheek, the chin twisted in the opposite direction, the upper lip swollen like a bubble and cracked to boot, and brief not handsome at all. They all spoke gruffly as though they were about to pounce on their interlocutors. Also, they made frequent libations to Bacchus, demonstrating thereby the pagan vestiges still present in the character of the Slav. Sometimes they came to the office after having thoroughly pickled themselves, as they put it, and this didn't make it a very pleasant place to be. The air could by no means be described as fragrant at such times. Among such as these, Chichikov couldn't fail to stand out in appearance as well as in his pleasant tone and also in his complete scorn for strong beverages. But despite this, he had a very hard time since he came under the authority of a senile head clerk who was waiting for his retirement and could easily have been taken for the embodiment of stony indifference and imperturbability. stony indifference and imperturbability. Always inaccessible, his inferiors had never seen him smile, never heard him inquire after anyone's health or anything of that sort. No one had ever seen him otherwise, in the street or in his own home. Never did he show any interest in anything. Never once did he get drunk and laugh in his drunkenness. It would have been better if he'd abandoned himself even once to savage joy, the way a bandit lets himself go in a moment of drunkenness, but there was not the slightest possibility of this ever happening. There was nothing at all in him, nothing vicious, nothing kind, and this very nothingness was quite terrifying. His coarse, stony face was unmarred by any striking irregularity, and indeed his features had a sort of austere harmony all their own, which made his face quite unlike any other. Only the dents and pits of pockmarks placed it in the category of those on which, as they say, the devil has come to break dried peas at night. It seemed it was humanly impossible to get close to a man like that and to gain his good graces, but Chichikov had a good go at it. At first he tried to please him in all sorts of little things. He watched to see how the old man liked his quills sharpened, and then would always prepare a few of them and keep them handy for him. He swept sand and tobacco off the old man's desk. He got hold of a new rag to clean his inkstand with. He discovered where the old man kept his hat, the most wretched piece of headgear imaginable, and always fetched it and put it near him a minute or two before the end of the day. He brushed his back if the old man had leaned against the chalky wall. But none of this seemed to get him anywhere. The old man didn't appear to notice the little services rendered him. Finally, Chichikov found out about the old man's private life. He learned that his chief had a daughter with a face which also looked as though dried peas had been broken on it at night. And it was from this direction that he decided to start his assault. He found out what church she attended on Sundays, and he would place himself in front of her, dressed very neatly, his shirt front starched with special lavishness for the occasion. And here he met with some success. The austere head clerk reacted and invited Chichikov to tea. And before anyone in the office knew what to think of it, Chichikov had moved into the old man's house and become indispensable. He bought supplies of flour and sugar for them, treated the daughter as if he was betrothed to her, called the old man Papa. Everyone in the office was certain that the wedding would be celebrated by the end of February, before Lent. The stern head clerk started to look around to see whether there wasn't some way to obtain a promotion for Chichikov. He went to see his superiors about it, and when a vacancy appeared in the neighboring office, Chichikov was made a head clerk himself. With this, he seemed to have achieved the object of his relations with the old head clerk, for that very night, he packed and sent his suitcase back to his old quarters, himself returning there the next evening. He ceased to call the old head clerk Papa, and no one ever heard him say anything about marrying his former chief's daughter, so that it was as if there had never been anything between the two. However, when he came across him, Chichikov always shook him by the hand and invited him pleasantly to tea, and the old head clerk, despite his stony indifference and permanent immobility of feature, would shake his head and mutter between his teeth, "He's double-crossed me. He's double-crossed me, the son of a bitch." That had been Chichikov's most difficult hurdle. After everything went faster and more smoothly, he became a person of note. It turned out that he had everything needed for success in this world: pleasant manners and toughness in business. Using these advantages, he soon worked himself into a spot where people found it in their interest to be nice to him, and he made the most of it. It must be kept in mind that at that particular time, drastic measures were being taken against graft. This didn't frighten him in the least. In fact, he turned the new measures to his advantage, which only goes to show that Russian inventiveness is at its best when freedom of action is restricted. Here's how he proceeded. When a petitioner arrived with his hand in his pocket, ready to bring out the well-known letter of recommendation with the signature of the Treasurer General on it, he would say with a smile, "No, so you thought that Oh, no, it's our duty, you see, our function to serve you without reward. You may rest assured that by tomorrow everything will be completed as far as I am concerned. Why not leave me your address, an apartment number? Then you won't even have to bother. I'll have it delivered." The charmed petitioner returned home almost ecstatic, thinking, "Now there's a man. I wish we had more like him. A precious gem." But on the next day, the papers the petitioner expects are not delivered as promised. Nothing arrives on the following day either. He goes to inquire. The case hasn't even been attended to. He asks to see the precious gem. "Oh, I do hope you'll excuse me," Chichikov exclaims very affably, seizing both the visitor's hands. "You see, we had such an awful lot of business to attend to, but it will be done tomorrow without fail. Really, I feel quite embarrassed." And all this was accompanied by the most enchanting gestures, and if the petitioner's coat chanced to open, Chichikov's hand would fly out to put it back in place and hold it there. But 1 day, 2 days, 3 days goes by, and the papers do not arrive. The petitioner decides there must be something behind it. He makes inquiries, and is told that he ought to give something to the copying clerks. "Certainly," he said. "Why not? I'm ready to give them a quarter ruble each." "No, not a quarter ruble. Give them 25 rubles apiece." "What? 25 rubles for each of these pen pushers? Why get so excited? You needn't worry. The pen pushers won't get more than a quarter ruble each. The rest goes to their chiefs." The naive petitioner slaps himself on the forehead and uses foul words to describe the anti-graft campaign, the new style of taking bribes, and the gracious affability of officials. Before, you at least knew where you stood. You gave a 10-ruble bill to the fellow in charge and the deed was done. But now you had to pay 25 rubles to each copying clerk, and you had to waste a whole week before you got wise to the business. The hell with disinterestedness. The hell with disinterestedness and feelings of duty. Of course, the petitioner's right to feel this way, but to make up for it, one finds no corrupt officials above a certain level. Everyone in charge is now scrupulously honest and respectable. And it's only secretaries and copying clerks who are crooks. But soon Chichikov found much wider scope for his activities. A committee was formed for the construction of an important government building. He managed to become a member of this committee, and a very active member at that. The committee went to work immediately. They fussed around the building for about 6 years, but either because the climate was unsuitable or because building materials were scarce, after all those years it turned out that only the foundations had been laid. In the meantime, however, beautiful private mansions, each belonging to a member of the committee, appeared in various corners of the town. Probably the soil there was much better suited to construction. The committee members prospered and reared their families, and it was only at this point that Chichikov started to loosen the bonds of his drastic rules of abstinence and austere self-denial. Only now did he relent in his long fast, and it developed that he had always had a taste for good living, but that nevertheless he'd been able to control himself during the ardent years of his youth, a time when no one is entirely master of his passions. He indulged in a few luxuries. He took on a good cook and bought some fine shirts of Holland linen. As to the material for his frock coat, he got himself some of the better quality than anyone else in the province, and from that time on he always kept to scintillating brownish and reddish tinges. He bought himself a pair of fine horses and liked to take the reins himself, making the side horse prance. At this point he had already acquired his habit of sponging himself with water scented with a little eau de cologne, and now he started to buy a special soap that was supposed to communicate a smoothness and softness to the skin. Then, suddenly, a new big chief was appointed in place of the old doormat who'd been in charge. This was a former army man, a disciplinarian, and a hater of graft, and of everything that comes under the heading of corruption. The very first day after his installation, he gave them all a bad scare. He demanded the financial records and found that funds were missing. Then he also found out about the beautiful mansions of the committee members. A full inquiry was ordered. Officials were dismissed. The beautiful mansions were confiscated by the National Treasury and turned into a variety of charitable institutions and schools for the children of the Army's long-term servicemen. It was as though a hurricane had passed over the accumulated assets of every member of the committee, and Chichikov suffered perhaps most of all. God knows why, perhaps for no reason at all, and his new chief took a violent dislike to Chichikov's face, despite its pleasantness. But being a military man and thus unable to see through the subtleties of civilian intrigues, he allowed some highly adaptable officials to worm their way into his good graces by putting on airs of intransigent incorruptibility. And so in no time he found himself in the hands of the biggest crooks of the lot, although, of course, he never suspected it. In fact, he was terribly pleased with his ability to pick the right people and boasted of his subtle gift of discrimination. The officials had sized up his spirit and temperament, and every one of his immediate subordinates became a tireless fighter against dishonesty. They pursued dishonesty everywhere like a fisherman pursues a big white salmon. And they were so successful in their efforts that soon every one of them had several thousand rubles in capital. In the meantime, many of the former officials who had expiated their sins and been converted to righteousness were reinstated. But Chichikov was not one of them, despite all his efforts and those of the chief's secretary, who was, of course, prompted by letters of recommendation signed by the Treasurer General. Even he, who in most matters could see the chief's nose as a rudder to steer his course, couldn't do a thing for Chichikov. The chief was the type of man who, although he could be led by the nose without realizing it, was likely to stick at a certain point, and then it was impossible to budge him. All the secretary could do for Chichikov was to have his name removed from the blacklist. And this he achieved only by painting a movingly pathetic picture of the plight of a whole innocent family who, luckily for them, Chichikov didn't have. "Well, so that's that," Chichikov said. "I got a bite, started pulling, but the line snapped. Crying won't help. I must get busy on something else." And he resolved to start on a new career, to be patient, to return to his former austerity, however much he might have enjoyed letting himself go for a while. He decided to move to another town and to work his way up there. For a while, nothing seemed to work. Within a short space of time, he changed jobs 2 or 3 times, as each seemed to him too lowly and too undignified. It must be understood that by nature Chichikov was as sensitive to decorum as any man living or dead. And although he had started his life amidst squalor and vulgarity, his heart had remained unstained, and he had always liked the tables and the offices to be polished and a dignified atmosphere to be maintained. He never allowed himself to use a doubtful word in conversation and resented any lack of respect for rank and position in others. I am sure the reader will be delighted to hear that he unfailingly changed his underwear every other day, and even every day during summer heat waves, as the slightest unpleasantness offended him. For this very reason, when Petrusha came to help him pull off his boots, he always put cloves in his nostrils. In this and many other ways, he was almost as sensitive as a maiden, and it's therefore easy to see how painful it was for him to return among those who exuded vulgarity and stale vodka. Despite his efforts to keep a stiff upper lip, he lost weight and acquired an unhealthy, greenish complexion from all he had to go through. When the reader met him for the first time, he was already regaining his decent, rounded shape and was again starting to toy with thoughts of a wife and a nursery and to smile when thinking of them. But at the time we're describing now, whenever by chance he saw his face in a mirror, he couldn't help exclaiming, "Holy Mother of God, how repulsive I've become!" And he avoided looking at his reflection. But our hero bore it all. He bore his hardships with fortitude and finally got himself an acceptable job in customs and excise